February 8th, 1943. The bridge of the USS Wahoo cut through Black Pacific waters 200 miles northwest of Palau, moving at 17 knots toward what Commander Dudley Morton called a target-rich environment. Morton, whom his crew called Mush, stood with his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, studying the darkness ahead. They'd been at sea for 12 days, and in that time, Wahoo had already sunk 3 Japanese freighters. But this patrol would be different. This patrol would announce to the Imperial Japanese Navy that the rules of the Pacific War had fundamentally changed. Within the next 10 days, Morton and O'Kane would sink 6 more ships, including a troop transport carrying over 1,000 Japanese soldiers, 9 ships total in a single patrol, a rampage that seemed impossible to Japanese commanders who received the loss reports. How could one American submarine, moving alone through Japanese-controlled waters, inflict such catastrophic damage? The question haunted Admiral Koga Minichi, who had recently assumed command of the combined fleet after Yamamoto's death. He sat in his office in Truk, reading patrol reports that described American submarines operating with apparent impunity throughout the Pacific. The numbers didn't make sense. Japan had started the war with one of the largest submarine fleets in the world, over 170 boats, including some of the most technologically advanced submarines ever built. The massive I-class fleet submarines could travel 20,000 miles without refueling. Some carried seaplanes that could be launched to scout ahead. They were marvels of engineering, larger and more capable than anything the Americans possessed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yet by early 1943, while American submarines were devastating Japanese merchant shipping, Japan's own submarine force had achieved relatively modest results against Allied commerce. Koga studied the comparative figures. Japanese submarines had sunk perhaps 30 to 40 merchant vessels in the war's first 14 months. The Americans, despite starting with fewer boats and fighting through catastrophic torpedo failures for the first 2 years, were now sinking Japanese merchant ships at 10 times that rate. What was happening? How had the Americans, whose submarine force represented barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's total personnel, managed to wage a campaign that threatened to strangle Japan's entire war effort? And why had Japan's submarine force, built around a doctrine of fleet support and decisive surface engagement, failed to inflict similar devastation on American supply lines? The answer lay not in technology or courage. Both navies possessed capable submarines and brave crews willing to die for their countries. The answer lay in something more fundamental. In the different ways the two nations understood what submarines were for, and in the mathematical reality of what happens when a maritime empire fails to protect the merchant ships that keep it alive. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. As Japanese carrier aircraft withdrew from the burning American base, leaving 8 battleships sunk or damaged, the Japanese High Command celebrated what appeared to be a devastating strategic victory. Admiral Yamamoto had achieved tactical surprise. The American Pacific Fleet's battle line had been effectively neutralized, but beneath the smoke and chaos in the submarine pens at Pearl Harbor, 51 American submarines sat undamaged. The Japanese attack had focused on battleships and carriers on the surface fleet that represented traditional naval power. The submarines, those unglamorous boats that operated in the shadows, had been ignored. It was a decision that would haunt Japan for the next 3.5 years. Within hours of the attack, Admiral Thomas C. Hart, commanding the Asiatic Fleet in Manila, radioed his submarine force with orders that would define the Pacific War's undersea campaign. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings, no prize rules. Any Japanese vessel, military or civilian, was now a legitimate target. It was a dramatic departure from international maritime law, a decision that the American government made without extensive deliberation or public announcement. The Japanese had attacked without warning. The gloves were off, but the American submarine force that began operations in December 1941 was woefully unprepared for the campaign ahead. 56 submarines deployed across the Pacific, a force that looked formidable on paper but suffered from deficiencies so severe that they would waste the war's first 2 years. The Mark 14 torpedo, the primary weapon for American submarines, was catastrophically flawed. Torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets. Magnetic exploders detonated prematurely or not at all. Contact exploders, the backup system, often failed on impact, the firing pin unable to trigger the warhead when the torpedo hit at the right angle. Submarine commanders, brave men who closed to point-blank range to ensure hits, watched in fury as their torpedoes either missed, exploded prematurely, or struck their targets with a dull thud and failed to detonate. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Parks, commanding USS Pompano, fired 4 torpedoes at a Japanese tanker from 1,500 yards. All 4 hit. None exploded. The tanker escaped unharmed. The torpedo problem should have been solved in peacetime testing, but the Bureau of Ordnance, confident in its design, had skipped live fire trials against realistic targets to save money. When submarine commanders returned from patrols reporting failures, the Bureau blamed the skippers, suggesting they were missing their targets or operating the torpedoes incorrectly. It took until September 1943, nearly 2 years into the war, before all the Mark 14's flaws were finally corrected. Those 2 years represented a staggering waste. American submarines made thousands of attacks that should have resulted in sinkings, but ended in frustration. Japanese merchant ships that should have been sent to the bottom escaped to continue supplying Japanese forces across the Pacific. If American submarines had possessed working torpedoes from December 1941 onward, Japan's merchant fleet might have collapsed by mid-1943 instead of late 1944. But even with defective torpedoes, American submarines began learning the fundamentals of commerce warfare. In 1942, despite the torpedo crisis, U.S. submarines sank approximately 180 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling 625,000 tons. It wasn't nearly what they should have achieved, but it was enough to begin raising concerns in Tokyo. Japanese merchant shipping had started the war with roughly 6 million tons of capacity. The ships that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japan, that transported food from Korea and Taiwan to the home islands, that moved troops and supplies to garrison forces across the Pacific. These vessels, mostly civilian freighters pressed into military service, operated under the assumption that they faced minimal submarine threat. Japan's pre-war naval doctrine, heavily influenced by American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan, had focused almost entirely on the decisive fleet engagement. The great battle where Japan's combined fleet would meet the American Pacific Fleet and destroy it in a single climactic action, as Admiral Togo had destroyed the Russian fleet at Tsushima Strait in 1905. Submarines in this framework were fleet auxiliaries. Their job was to scout for the main fleet, to attenuate enemy forces before the decisive battle, perhaps to deliver a crippling blow against enemy capital ships. Using submarines against merchant shipping, the slow and unglamorous work of commerce warfare didn't fit this vision. It wasn't honorable. It wasn't decisive. It was the kind of warfare that Germany had pursued with U-boats in World War I, and Germany had lost that war. Japan would win through superior spiritual power and aggressive surface action, not by skulking in the depths, attacking civilian vessels. This doctrinal commitment to fleet operations meant Japan allocated minimal resources to protecting its merchant marine. At the war's start, Japan possessed fewer than 50 escort vessels capable of anti-submarine warfare. Most destroyers and cruisers were assigned to carrier task forces and battleship divisions, prepared for the decisive engagement that never came. Merchant ships typically sailed independently or in poorly escorted convoys, following predictable routes, maintaining radio silence that, paradoxically, made them easier for submarines to find because they couldn't communicate threats. The contrast with American doctrine couldn't have been starker. The U.S. Navy submarine force, though small, had spent the 1930s developing tactics specifically for commerce warfare. The plan, developed long before Pearl Harbor, was straightforward. If war came with Japan, American submarines would attack the merchant shipping that kept Japan's island empire alive. Sink the tankers, and Japan's war machine stops. Sink the freighters, and Japanese garrisons starve. Sink the troop ships, and Japan can't reinforce its defensive perimeter. It was unglamorous work. It didn't involve glorious surface engagements or dramatic carrier duels, but it was mathematically devastating if executed properly. Japan imported nearly everything its war effort required: oil, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, rice, an island nation utterly dependent on maritime trade. Every merchant ship sunk was a blow not just to Japan's immediate military capacity, but to the long-term sustainability of the entire war effort. Commander Dudley Morton understood this better than most. When Wahoo returned from her February 1943 patrol, Morton and O'Kane had proven what aggressive submarine warfare could achieve. 9 ships sunk, 20,000 tons sent to the bottom, hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors killed. The Navy promoted Morton to the Submarine Command's aggressive skipper list and sent Wahoo back out with orders to repeat the performance. Other submarine commanders took notice. If Morton could sink 9 ships in one patrol, why couldn't others match that? The submarine force, which had spent 1942 learning to cope with defective torpedoes and overcautious tactics, began to transform into aggressive commerce raiding machine. Submarine division commanders started relieving skippers who couldn't produce results. Aggressive commanders who took risks and sank ships received the best boats and the most promising patrol areas. The message was clear: attack, attack, attack. By mid-1943, American codebreakers had fully penetrated Japanese merchant ship codes. Submarines received intelligence about convoy routes, schedules, and composition. They knew where to wait. They knew what was coming. Combined with the finally corrected Mark 14 torpedoes, this intelligence advantage transformed the submarine campaign from opportunistic hunting to systematic slaughter. In July 1943, USS Trigger, under Commander Roy Benson, patrolled the waters off Japan's eastern coast. Codebreakers had alerted Benson to a convoy carrying critical raw materials from the Dutch East Indies to Japan. Benson positioned Trigger in the convoy's path and waited. The convoy arrived precisely as predicted. 4 torpedoes, 4 hits, 2 large freighters sunk. Benson repositioned and attacked again 2 hours later. 3 more torpedoes, 2 more hits, another freighter sent down. The convoy scattered in confusion, and Benson withdrew. His work accomplished. Attacks like these, multiplied across dozens of submarines patrolling throughout Japanese waters, began to destroy Japan's merchant fleet faster than shipyards could replace losses. In 1943, U.S. submarines sank approximately 335 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 1.5 million tons. It was nearly double the previous year's total, achieved with roughly the same number of submarines because the torpedoes now worked and the tactics had matured. Japanese convoy commanders receiving the loss reports couldn't understand how American submarines seemed to know exactly where they would be. The notion that Americans had broken Japanese codes remained inconceivable to Japanese intelligence officers. Japanese codes were Japanese. They used Japanese language concepts and cultural references that no Westerner could possibly understand. The idea that American codebreakers, including Japanese-American Nisei translators, had mastered these codes was literally unthinkable within the framework of Japanese racial superiority doctrine. So, they attributed submarine success to luck, to aggressive tactics, to anything except the truth, that Americans were reading their mail. This blindness would persist throughout the war, costing Japan hundreds of additional ships that could have been saved with better routing or stronger escorts if only Tokyo had acknowledged the intelligence breach. Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuichi, the man who had led the carrier attack on Pearl Harbor, found himself in late 1943 pondering Japan's submarine situation. Nagumo had been shunted to shore duty after the carrier battles of 1942, his reputation damaged by the defeats at Midway and the Eastern Solomons. From his desk in Tokyo, he could see patterns that eluded officers still focused on the decisive surface engagement. American submarines were winning the war, not the carriers, not the battleships, not the strategic bombing campaign that hadn't yet begun in earnest. The submarines, those unglamorous boats operating largely unseen, were systematically destroying Japan's ability to sustain the war. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies were dropping precipitously. Food shipments from Korea and Taiwan were becoming unreliable. Troop movements to reinforce garrison forces were turning into death sentences as submarines hunted transport convoys with deadly efficiency. Nagumo wrote a memo to the Naval General Staff arguing for a massive reallocation of resources toward anti-submarine warfare. Build more escort vessels, develop better sonar and depth charges, implement comprehensive convoy systems with trained escort groups, abandon the fantasy of the decisive battle and focus on protecting the merchant marine that kept Japan alive. The memo was read, filed, and largely ignored. The decisive battle was still coming, the Naval General Staff insisted. Resources couldn't be diverted from carrier and battleship construction for defensive operations that didn't fit Japan's offensive spirit. This institutional blindness, this refusal to acknowledge that modern war was as much about logistics and industrial capacity as about fleet engagements, would prove catastrophic, because 1944, the year American submarines reached peak effectiveness, was about to begin. And 1944 would be the year Japan's merchant fleet died. The year opened with USS Tang under Commander Richard O'Kane, who had been Dudley Morton's executive officer on Oahu before getting his own command. O'Kane possessed Morton's aggressive instincts refined by technical precision. He studied target approach angles, calculated torpedo spreads with mathematical exactitude, and trained his crew to operate with mechanical efficiency. Tang's first patrol in January 1944 resulted in 5 Japanese ships sunk. The second patrol in March, another 5 ships. The third patrol in June, an additional 5 ships, including escorts. O'Kane's tactics became the model. Close-range attacks, often on the surface at night, using radar to track targets the Japanese couldn't see, fire multiple torpedoes in carefully calculated spreads to ensure hits. Don't wait for the perfect setup. Good enough was good enough if you attacked aggressively. Withdraw quickly after attack. Dive deep if escorts counterattacked. Then besurface and attack again once the escorts moved away. It was methodical, efficient, and devastatingly effective. Other submarines followed Tang's example. USS Flasher, under Commander Reuben Whittaker. USS Rasher, under Commander Willard Lawson. USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey. These boats and their commanders formed the elite of the submarine force, the ones who consistently sank more ships than their peers. They competed informally to see who could rack up the highest tonnage. But for every success, there were costs. Submarines operated alone, deep in enemy waters, facing increasing Japanese anti-submarine efforts. In February 1944, USS Greyback failed to return from patrol, sunk by Japanese aircraft off Okinawa, with all 80 hands lost. In March, USS Trout was sunk by Japanese escorts after attacking a convoy. In June, USS Herring struck a mine off the Kuril Islands and went down with her crew. 52 American submarines would be lost during the war, with 3,505 submariners killed. It represented roughly 20% of the men who served on submarines, the highest casualty rate of any American military branch. The men who volunteered for submarine duty knew the risks. They knew that if their boat was sunk, survival was unlikely. Deep water, cold temperatures, Japanese forces unlikely to rescue American sailors. If your submarine went down, you probably died with it. Yet there was no shortage of volunteers. Submarine pay was higher than surface navy. Submarine food was notoriously better. Submarine crews received 2 weeks of rest and recreation in places like Perth or Pearl Harbor between patrols. But more than that, submarine sailors knew they were winning the war. Every ship they sank was one less ship carrying supplies to Japanese forces. Every tanker sent to the bottom was fuel that would never reach Japanese aircraft or ships. The work was dangerous, but it mattered in ways that surface engagements often didn't. By mid-1944, the impact of the submarine campaign was becoming visible in Japan itself. Fuel rationing, already in effect for civilians, now extended to military operations. Pilots received reduced training hours because there wasn't enough aviation fuel for practice flights. Ships stayed in port because there wasn't fuel for operations. The mighty battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, sat at anchor for months because moving her required oil that Japan didn't have. Food shortages began affecting military readiness. Soldiers training for the defense of the home islands received fewer than 2,000 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic function. Factory workers in war industries received reduced rations and struggled to maintain productivity. The black market flourished as civilians scrambled for rice and other staples that the official distribution system could no longer reliably provide. The submarines hadn't just cut Japan's supply lines, they'd put a noose around Japan's neck and were slowly, methodically, pulling it tight. And Japan, committed to its doctrine of offensive surface warfare, continued building carriers and battleships while the merchant fleet that sustained the nation bled to death. In Tokyo, a few clear-eyed officers recognized the catastrophe unfolding. Captain Nakahara Gichi, a logistics specialist attached to the Naval General Staff, compiled statistics that told a story of impending collapse. In 1944 alone, American submarines were projected to sink over 450 merchant ships, totaling nearly 2.5 million tons. That was more than Japan's entire shipbuilding industry could produce. The merchant fleet wasn't just shrinking, it was dying at an accelerating rate. Nakahara prepared a presentation for the Naval General Staff showing that without immediate dramatic action, Japan's merchant marine would be effectively destroyed by late 1945, making continued military operations impossible. The economy would collapse, the home islands would starve, defeat would be inevitable. He argued for emergency measures, suspend all naval construction, except escorts and merchant ships, recall all major surface units to direct escort duty, abandon offensive operations entirely in favor of protecting the supply lines that kept Japan alive. The Naval General Staff listened politely. Then they explained to Nakahara that his numbers, while concerning, didn't account for Japanese fighting spirit. American submarines were achieving temporary success, but the tide would turn once Japan's carrier forces regrouped and offensive operations resumed. The decisive engagement was still possible. Victory was still achievable if Japan maintained its offensive spirit and didn't succumb to defensive thinking. Nakahara returned to his desk, his warnings unheeded. He would watch over the next year as his projections came true. With mathematical precision, the merchant fleet would shrink from 6 million tons to barely 500,000 tons by August 1945. But by then, it would be too late. The war would be over. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, American submarines had already won the war. They'd sunk approximately 1,150 Japanese merchant ships, totaling over 5 million tons. They'd destroyed roughly 200 Japanese warships. They'd severed the arteries that kept Japan's war machine alive, strangling an empire one convoy at a time. The final accounting revealed the asymmetry that made the title's hyperbole almost unnecessary. The U.S. submarine force, comprising roughly 16,000 men at its peak, had sunk over 55% of all Japanese merchant shipping losses during the war. Meanwhile, Japan's submarine force, which began the war with 175 boats and superior technology, had sunk approximately 184 Allied merchant vessels, totaling just under 1 million tons. The disparity wasn't just significant, it was catastrophic. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Why had Japanese submarines, larger and more capable than their American counterparts, achieved so little? The answer lay in doctrine and vision. Japan used its submarines as fleet auxiliaries, positioning them to attack enemy warships rather than merchantmen. Japanese submarines spent the war trying to sink American carriers and battleships, scoring occasional successes like the carrier Wasp, but missing the opportunity to devastate American supply lines, the way American submarines devastated Japan's. The institutional blindness that prevented Japan from protecting its merchant fleet was matched by an equal blindness about how to employ its own submarine force. Both failures stemmed from the same source, an obsession with the decisive battle, with glorious surface engagement, with offensive spirit over cold logistical mathematics. Japan built a navy to win battles. America built a submarine force to win a war. The difference proved decisive. Admiral Toyoda Somu, who commanded the combined fleet in the war's final year, later reflected that American submarines had accomplished what no other weapon system could. They'd made it impossible for Japan to continue fighting. The strategic bombing campaign had devastated Japanese cities, but submarines had already collapsed Japan's economy. The island-hopping campaign had seized key positions, but submarines had made those positions impossible for Japan to supply. Even the atomic bombs, horrific as they were, merely provided the final psychological shock to leadership that already knew the war was lost. The submarines had done it quietly, methodically, operating in the shadows while battleships and carriers fought for headlines. 16,000 submariners, of whom 3,505 died in service, had strangled an empire. They proved that modern naval warfare wasn't ultimately about steel clashing against steel in dramatic surface engagements. It was about logistics, about sustainability, about the unglamorous work of cutting supply lines and watching your enemy slowly suffocate. Japan's admirals had built the wrong navy to fight the wrong war. They'd prepared for Tsushima while America waged unrestricted commerce warfare. They'd protected their battle fleet while their merchant fleet died. They'd sought glory while America sought victory. And in the end, the submarines won, sinking everything that kept Japan alive, one ship at a time, until there was nothing left to sink. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.